You are nothing without me. Laura's voice exploded through the courtroom, sharp enough to rattle the windows. For a moment, everything froze. The jurors blinked, the attorneys stiffened, and the gallery behind us shifted with a collective gasp. Even the judge paused before slamming his gavel down, his deep voice commanding order. But the words were already loose, clinging to the air, like smoke from a fire you could not put out. I sat at the defense table, 60 years old, and steadying myself against a wave that wanted to knock me down. I felt the heat in my chest, the sting of humiliation crawling across my skin. I kept my face still, jaw tight, eyes locked straight ahead. I had learned long ago that silence could cut deeper than shouting, and that in moments like these, the loudest thing you could say was nothing at all. Laura stood at the witness stand, her face flushed, her hand trembling as she pointed at me, 58 years old, and still able to command a room not with grace anymore, but with venom. Her lawyer tugged at her sleeve, whispering urgently, but she pulled her arm away, her eyes drilling into mine as if she had finally struck the killing blow. I glanced toward the gallery and saw my daughter, Nora. She sat with her shoulders drawn tight, 33 years old, but looking like the child I used to carry on my back when she scraped her knees. Her hand gripped Emily's so hard that her knuckles had turned pale. My granddaughter sat beside her, 10 years old, and clutching a stuffed horse in her lap, the one she never left behind. Emily's wide eyes darted between her grandmother and me, confused and frightened, trying to understand how the people she loved could turn into enemies in front of strangers. My stomach twisted. Laura's words had been aimed at me, but they had pierced straight into the people I loved most. That was her real weapon, not the shouting, but the way she dragged everyone else into the battlefield. I shifted slightly in my chair, the leather creaking under my weight. My right hand slipped to the floor, brushing against the side of my briefcase. Inside was a manila folder, plain and unremarkable from the outside, but heavier than everything else in that courtroom combined. My thumb traced its edge, reminding myself that it was still there, waiting. That single piece of paper carried the power Laura thought she had ripped from me. It was why I could sit there calm while she tried to tear me apart. The judge leaned forward, his voice sharp as he warned that outbursts would not be tolerated again. Laura sat down slowly, her chest rising and falling, her lips pressed tight as she tried to regain control. Her lawyer shook his head, muttering under his breath, already knowing the damage her words had caused. I didn't move. I didn't flinch. I stared straight ahead, letting her think I had swallowed the blow. Inside, though, I felt the sting of 25 years being reduced to 6 words. You are nothing without me. After decades of building a life, of working long nights, of pouring my body and soul into land and business and family, this was the legacy she wanted stamped on my name. My gaze drifted past her 2 rows back and landed on Michael Turner. Arms folded, chin high, his face calm in a way that made me want to stand up and knock it off. 20 years ago, he had been my closest friend. He was there at my father's funeral, standing beside me when I thought I couldn't lift the casket. He was there at the office late nights, sketching designs while I pored over contracts. Now he sat there watching me fall apart, or at least hoping I would. Betrayal is an odd thing. It doesn't come all at once. It creeps in slow and silent until the day you finally see it fully formed in front of you. That day had arrived for me long before this courtroom, but seeing Michael here, his arms crossed like a man waiting for his prize, made the betrayal feel fresh again. I drew a deep breath, steady and slow, filling my chest until the trembling in my hands stilled. I thought of the ranch back in the Gallatin Valley, the stretch of land where my grandfather broke ground with horses and sweat. I thought of my father teaching me to mend fence posts with splinters in my palms, of the smell of cut hay and wet soil after a storm. That land was more than acreage on a map. It was legacy stitched into every fiber of who I was. Laura could scream that I was nothing, but she could never touch what was rooted in that soil. Nora's eyes met mine again. There was a flicker of something in them, not anger, not despair, but faith. A silent plea to hold on to, not let her mother's words undo me. She gave the slightest nod, almost imperceptible, but enough to anchor me. Emily pressed the stuffed horse against her chest, her small body leaning into her mother's side, as if the toy could shield her from the storm. The bailiff shifted his stance. Papers rustled. The hum of the air vent filled the silence Laura had left behind. The judge called the next witness, moving the trial forward, though the air still felt heavy with what had just been spoken. I leaned back in my chair, my hand still resting on the briefcase at my feet. The folder inside was patient. Timing mattered more than pride. Let Laura believe she had landed her blow. Let Michael think his plan was unfolding. Let the gallery whisper about the man who sat silent while his wife tore him apart. I knew better. I knew silence was not defeat. It was preparation. And when the moment came, that single sheet of paper would speak louder than anything Laura could scream. So I sat still, steady, my gaze fixed forward, waiting. The judge moved on to the next order of business, and the murmur of papers and footsteps faded into a steady hum. Gallatin was a wide bowl of grass and river and sky, and the wind there had a way of sanding a boy down to the shape of a man. I learned early that if a fence broke, you fixed it. If a creek rose, you worked with it. If winter came hard, you dug in and waited it out. I left for Bozeman in '83 with a second-hand duffel and a stack of scholarship forms. Montana State gave me a shot at an engineering degree, and I grabbed it with both hands. Those years were a blur of calculus and soil mechanics, and summers spent on road crews up in the mountains. I learned to keep my mouth shut when older men were talking, and to speak only when I had something worth saying. Work carried me across a patchwork of small towns. Livingston, Townsend, Big Timber. But the jobs stacked up, and with them the trust of county commissioners and ranch families and school boards, who needed asphalt to last and culverts to hold. I met Laura in '98 at a fundraiser in Helena, a room filled with polite laughter and the rattle of ice in glasses. She was teaching a community class on interior design and knew every person in the room by name. She asked what I did, and I told her the truth. I moved dirt for a living. She laughed and said, "Then you move the world." And for a little while I believed she meant it. Laura moved into the farmhouse outside Belgrade and filled it with light and fresh flowers and friends who brought wine I could not pronounce. I was the man who made things stand upright, and she was the woman who made them worth looking at. In 2010, after a decade of stacking hours under other people's shingle, I put my name on the door. Hayes Construction began in a rented shop with a leaky roof and 8 employees who were willing to bet on me. Rural water lines that needed to run through bedrock. County bridges that had to be open before winter. Subdivisions on the edge of Bozeman, where new families wanted streets that did not flood. The first winter nearly sank us. A loader blew a transmission, a client paid 30 days late, and a storm shut down a site where a foundation lay open to the sky. She was good in a crisis then. She knew how to steady a room, how to look a banker in the eye and speak a language that made him lean back and nod. I felt like we were pulling the rope the same direction. Our daughter Nora was 10 when she first came to the shop and watched me grease a dozer. She wrinkled her nose at the smell and asked if my work hurt. "Only on the days that end in Y," I said, and she grinned and told me that was all of them. She wanted a classroom and a stack of library cards and the kind of life that smelled like chalk and fresh paper. I respected that. By 23, we had 70 people on payroll and a calendar that kept me crossing the valley and back again. The hospital in Bozeman hired us to expand their parking and drainage. A developer brought us into a neighborhood project on the west side that needed roads in before fall. We were big enough to be noticed and still small enough to know every first name on every timesheet. There were weeks when I ate dinner off a tool chest, and nights when I came home so tired I sat in the truck with the engine off and my hands still on the wheel. Laura kept the lights warm and the fridge full, and she learned the names of my foremen and sent brownies to the crew that worked the Saturday pour. She was the face I wanted to see at the end of bad days. What I did not notice then, or maybe did not want to notice, was how that sentence shifted under my feet. The first time she said it, it sounded like pride. The 10th time, it sounded like agreement. And then slowly, it became something else. A reminder. A weight set on the table between us. An accounting of who owed who and by how much. I told myself I was imagining it. I told myself she had earned the right to say it any way she wanted. After all, she had stayed up late balancing our personal budgets when the company was still a question mark. She had stood next to me at charity breakfasts and ribbon cuttings and talked about the value of good roads with people who never saw their feet dirty. She softened me around the edges when I needed it. That was all true. But there were other truths. She liked the invitations that came with a company that showed up in the paper for finishing ahead of schedule. She liked the dinners where a developer asked her opinion on fixtures and called her by her first name, even though he had only just met her. It was the way it began to show in her eyes when something went wrong that set my teeth on edge. The subtle look that said the failure belonged on my side of the ledger. When we had 8 employees, she pulled on boots and brought coffee to the site. When we had 70, she brought brochures for a gala and asked if I could take a Friday off for a luncheon in Helena. There were nights when she would rest a hand on my shoulder and tell me that I was lucky to have her. The words landed softer then. Over time, they began to land hard. Not because she said them louder, but because she said them with a different meaning. As if everything above waterline was hers to claim, and everything below it, the concrete and rebar and payroll and risk, was mine alone. What I know is this. By the spring of 23, whenever she said those words, I heard an equation behind them. I heard a calculation. I began to dread the way her eyes would search my face after she said it, like a bookkeeper waiting for a number to match. The shop moved to a bigger yard outside Four Corners, and the new space smelled like cut lumber and oil and wet earth. We hired another estimator and a safety manager and a young engineer who reminded me of myself at 22. There were good days, many of them, and there were days when we whiffed a bid or a grader sat idle because a part was on back order. Through it all, that sentence tracked me. You are lucky to have me. It showed up when we bought a newer excavator and when we paid off the loan on the second dump truck. It showed up when the hospital signed their change order and when a county inspector praised our work. It also showed up when a client delayed payment and when the rain came sideways for a week straight and we missed a deadline. One evening in late summer, after a day that started before dawn and ended after the sun dropped behind the bridgers, I came home to find candles lit and dinner warm and Laura in a dress I had not seen in years. I told her I would do my best. She set a hand on my chest and said again that I was lucky to have her. I did not say anything. I did not have the words yet. I just nodded and went to wash the grit from my hands. Outside, the sprinkler clicked across the lawn. Inside, the house smelled like rosemary and garlic and something sweet in the oven. The feeling from the night before never left. It simply changed shape. By the first week of the new year, Laura began asking about things she had never cared to discuss. At first, I thought she was taking an interest because the company had grown. It felt harmless. It felt like a hand on the rope. A few weeks later, we finished a long pour west of town, and I pulled into the yard and realized my laptop sat on the kitchen counter where I had left it by mistake. I almost turned around, but the thought of a late-night email from the hospital project manager changed my mind. I went inside to grab the sealed hard copies of the bid addendum so I could scan them at home. I stepped in and paused. The file cabinet labeled Active Bids was open. Laura stood with her back to me near the window shoulders. Bent phone raised the faint sound of a shutter clicking, and then again. She did not hear me at first. When she turned and saw me, she startled, and the phone dipped toward her side. I walked to the cabinet and saw the folder she had opened. It did not read tax. It read vendor master and client proposals. I said nothing. I closed the drawer gently and picked up the envelope I had come for. I told her I would eat at home and that I would look at equipment purchases on Monday. She kissed my cheek and left. The next day, Thomas Green found me at the Four Corners yard leaning over a bent guardrail. We were patching for the county. He watched my face for a moment, then spoke low enough that the crew would not hear. He said he had seen Laura at the shop late the night before. He asked if everything was all right. I said I had walked in on her snapping pictures of contracts. He told me his ex-wife had done the same thing 6 months before her lawyer called the bank and started asking about lines of credit and account freezes. He said he had thought she was interested in his work and that he was blind until the papers arrived. He told me to be careful which drawers were left unlocked. I told myself not to jump at shadows. I also locked the cabinet when I left my office. When she asked about a new excavator we were considering, I told her the truth. I said we would wait until summer to decide. There were little things that would not have bothered me a year earlier. Names I did not recognize. Sandra this or Valerie that. I asked once who Sandra was, and she said, a woman from the community board who knew donors. The answer fit and did not fit at the same time. On a Tuesday night in March, I stayed late to finish a change order for the hospital drainage work. I got up to pour stale coffee and paused at the glass door to the conference room. The glow from the streetlights cut a faint reflection of the yard. In that reflection, I saw my office behind me and the cabinet where the active bids live. It is strange what a reflection will show you that a direct look will not. I could picture exactly where Laura had been standing, with her phone tilted just so. The next morning, I pulled the sign in logs for the past month. I told myself I was looking for a missing vendor signature. I was not. I was looking for patterns. Laura had been in the office 3 evenings that did not match any event or family errand. Twice she left within 15 minutes of my arrival. None of that proved anything. All of it proved something to me. By April, I stopped answering questions the moment they were asked. I began answering them the next day after I had time to decide how much I wanted to say. I kept a notepad in my pocket and wrote down everything I thought might matter. Dates, times, who called whom and at what hour. If you had asked me then why I was doing it, I would have said it was to protect the company. That was true. It was also because I felt the ground tilt and knew that a man standing on a slope had better widen his stance. Thomas caught my shoulder one afternoon while we waited on a concrete test. He said quietly that if I needed to talk to someone with a law degree, I should do it sooner rather than later. He told me the worst part of what he went through was not losing money. It was realizing he had seen the signs and ignored them because he wanted to believe he was safe. He looked tired in a way that sleep does not fix. I told him I heard him. I meant it. At home, the questions did not stop. Laura brought a folder to the dinner table and asked if we should consider adjusting our vendor terms to net 35 and whether any of our equipment was still titled personally rather than in the company. She asked if our insurance listed her as additional insured and whether it should. She asked if I had updated our wills. She smiled when she asked and touched my wrist and said she only wanted to make sure everything was in order. I nodded and said I would look into it. After dinner, I stood in the doorway and watched her stack papers in the den. She was humming. It should have been ordinary. It was not. That night I lay awake and stared at the ceiling fan slowly turning. The house made the same night sounds it had made for years, the refrigerator motor, the faint rush of the furnace, a car passing on the county road. I tried to picture a version of the story where her questions were simply care. I could not make the pieces fit. Somewhere under the noise a new beat had started, and once you hear it, you cannot unhear it. I got up, went to the office, locked the cabinets I had left open, and slid the manila folder from the back of the drawer into my briefcase. In the morning I called Thomas and told him to meet me early at the yard. He brought 2 coffees and handed me one without a word. The sun was just behind the bridgers, and frost still clung to the edges of the gravel. I told him I was going to start paying attention to everything. He said, "Good. Pay attention, write it down, and be ready." Then he added something that scraped against bone. He said the first time his ex-wife took pictures of his paperwork, her lawyer called the bank a week later. I looked at the calendar in my head and counted backward. That was the moment the suspicion stopped being a feeling and became a plan. I did not know yet where it would take me. I only knew the next step was to keep my eyes open and my mouth shut. The day stretched long into dark, and I let it staying busy until the crews shut down pumps and locked toolboxes. I was halfway home when I remembered the plan set I had promised to mark up before morning. The set lay rolled on my office desk where I had dropped it during a call with the hospital engineer. I turned the truck around and headed back toward the shop at 4 Corners, telling myself it would be 10 minutes in and out, then sleep. I unlocked the door and stepped inside. I kept the lights low and followed the thin band of light spilling out from my wing. It came from the design room where we kept the big table and drafting lamps. I paused before the doorway. Michael Turner was inside. He did not see me at first. He stood near the window with his back to the hall, one hand in his pocket, the other holding a phone to his ear. I took a step back into the shadow and waited. His voice carried enough for me to catch pieces. He said he had everything they needed, then he listed what everything meant. Client lists, contacts at the county, the exact bonding capacity our surety had approved. He said the underwriter had bumped our single project limit last fall, and that gave them room to move. I felt something cold run through my chest. My first thought was that I had misunderstood. Maybe he was talking a vendor through a pre-qualification. Maybe he was bragging in a way that would sound harmless if I heard the start. Then I heard Laura's name. Not the name itself, but the way he referred to her. He said she had already gathered copies and that her friend had forwarded what they could not photograph at the shop. He said a forensic guy had backed up the valuation and that the timing was right because of the divorce. He said once Daniel was forced to liquidate assets, the field would open. He said they would be ready. He turned his head a fraction, and I moved back into the hall, pressing close to the wall until my shoulders met drywall. Then I heard his chair scrape, and his voice again, lower now, almost casual. He said not to worry, that Daniel trusted people too much, that he always had, and that it was the weakness you could count on when everything else was uncertain. There is a particular kind of quiet that falls when a truth finally lands. I stood in that hallway and felt the temperature drop. I remembered Michael in a different season, standing beside me at my father's service, holding the door for my mother, driving my truck when my hands shook too hard to hold the wheel. I remembered the day he took Nora to the hardware store in a snowstorm to buy school project supplies because I could not leave a pore that had gone sideways. If he had walked into the hall just then and found me there, I do not know what I would have said. He did not. He kept talking. He said they would move fast once the judgment hit. He said they would secure the equipment leases and that the clients would follow relationships, not logos. He said the contractors who mattered liked him better anyway. Then he said something about a launch window and a name for the firm. I eased away from the wall and took the long route to my office, letting the carpet muffle my steps. I did not want to hear more. I did not want to give myself room to pretend later that I had misheard. The door to my office was ajar, and the plan set I had come for lay right where I left it, rubber band loose around the tube. My hands remembered the task. I slid the band back into place, picked up the tube, and tucked it under my arm. Then a chair leg scraped in the design room, and Michael's laugh cut across the quiet again, and the calm fell away. I stepped into the night and let the cold slap me clean. The lot stretched empty except for my truck and a flatbed waiting for an early haul. I stood there with the plans under my arm and let my jaw unclench. On the drive home, I kept the radio off. I collected fragments and set them carefully on the dash of my mind as if arranging parts for inspection. Laura with a legal pad writing down names she had never asked about before. Laura in my office with her phone tilted toward contracts that had nothing to do with tax. Michael with a voice that treated my company like a carcass already claimed. Each piece could be explained away on its own. Together, they were a map. I thought of confronting him. I rehearsed sentences that started out measured and ended up hard. I pictured myself walking back into the office, opening the door to the design room, and saying his name. I passed the dark curve by the river where the road narrows, and for once I did not tap the brake. When I reached the ranch road, I pulled over and shut down the engine and sat in the quiet so long that the chill crept into my collar. I went inside and placed the plan tube on the kitchen table and turned on one lamp. A simple list. Lock the cabinets that were not locked. Move key contact information to a place only Thomas and I could reach. Call David Morales and schedule coffee without notes in a calendar anyone could see. Ask Patricia Long if she had room on her schedule for a few days of quiet work. I did not yet have proof beyond ears and a bad feeling, and I did not want to walk blind into a storm. A man can mourn a friendship and still protect his house. The two are not mutually exclusive. Sleep would not come, so I worked. I unrolled the plans and circled a mistake on a catch basin detail and wrote a note to the young engineer to tighten the call-out. I checked a slope on the west lot and corrected the figure. When the first light started to thin the windows, I stood and stretched and felt the pull along my spine. I folded the list and slid it into my pocket. There are moments when a story stops being a story about faith and becomes a story about facts. In that long night, it happened. I did not know exactly how far the rot had run, whether it was only the two of them or something wider. I knew enough. I knew that whatever I had with Michael had shifted from companionship to calculation. I rinsed a cup, turned off the lamp, and stood for a last second at the window. The plan would start today. Morning came thin and bright, and I drove into Helena with a list in my pocket and a knot under my ribs. David Morales kept an office above a hardware store a few blocks from the courthouse. He asked how bad it was. I said I did not know yet, only that the ground was moving. I told him about Laura and her legal pad, about the pictures in my office, about the questions that felt like inventory. I told him about Michael in the design room and the words I had heard. When I finished, he nodded once and said we needed to move quickly. He explained that Montana divides marital property in a way that aims for fairness, not a perfect split down the middle, but close enough to give both sides a piece that looks like half. If a divorce is filed, the court can enter orders that freeze assets to keep anyone from moving money or equipment out of reach before a settlement. Banks can lock lines of credit if they fear a fight. Surety underwriters can put a hold on bonding. In short, he said, a single stack of papers can turn a working company into a stalled machine. He proposed a structure that drew a clean line between what the company used and who owned it. Hayes Construction would become, on paper and in practice, an operating company. The assets that carried true value would be held by a separate entity under a family trust. The land, the heavy equipment, the brand, and marks, the master service agreements and long-term contracts, all of that would be conveyed to a trust designed to hold family assets for the benefit of the bloodline. The operating company would lease what it needed at fair market rates, documented by schedules and invoices, the kind of paper that holds up when someone shines a bright light on it. He warned me this was not a magic trick. A judge can look through a sham. If the transfers smelled like a last-minute attempt to dodge a division, we could wind up worse off than before. It had to make sense for the business, not just for the fight. He said we would need appraisals on the equipment, independent valuations, where needed board resolutions, even if my board was a kitchen table with my name at the top. I asked if the ranch could live inside the same trust. He said yes, and added that a ranch that came to me by inheritance already had a different character in the eyes of the court. Separate property is separate if you keep it that way. He looked me in the eye and asked if that was my intention. I said it was, and that it had always been. Then he set the pen down and said the most important piece was time. If Laura filed before we filed our papers, a judge could freeze things and fight us move for move. If we put the structure in place now cleanly and openly, the story would be that we acted for business reasons that predated any filing. He gave us 2 weeks, 14 days to draft and sign and file, to appraise and schedule and notify, to take a working engine apart and set it back together running smoother than before. I asked about the risks. He said there were always risks. He said a court can still award money based on a value, even if the title sits with a trust, but that we would be in a far stronger position to argue for numbers that matched the reality of an operating company rather than an asset warehouse. We outlined tasks. He would draft the trust documents and the transfer agreements. I would commission appraisals and generate equipment schedules. He would prepare lease forms and a memorandum to send to our bank, and surety explaining the structure and affirming that operating income and obligations remained intact. I would meet with Thomas and the office manager and draw up lists of assets and contract assignments that could be conveyed where assignment was permitted. Where assignment required consent, we would prepare notices and circulate them methodically. I folded the to-do list and put it in my shirt pocket. My phone rang before I cleared the city limits. It was Martha. She asked if I was moving assets around. She asked if I was using a family trust to keep her and others from ever touching anything that came down from our father. I told her I was protecting the ranch and the business from a fight that could bleed them dry. I said our father trusted me to keep the land intact, and that the company fed families who did not deserve to become collateral damage in a divorce. I told her if she wanted to meet David with me, I would bring her into the room and let her ask every question she had. She went quiet for a few beats and then said she would think about it. Back at the yard, Thomas was leaning over a generator with a wrench in his hand. I told him we were going to restructure and that for a few weeks everything we did needed to be precise. He nodded and said he would run point on the asset list and the maintenance logs. He asked if I had a timeline. I told him 14 days. I called our surety agent and set a meeting for the morning. I called the banker we had worked with for a decade and told her I would be in to lay out a corporate housekeeping project. I avoided the word divorce. She did not ask. Near evening, I sat alone at my desk with the windows throwing long light across the carpet. The first drafts from David arrived by email. A trust with my name as grantor and a set of trustees that included a neutral professional, along with a provision that ensured the ranch would pass only within the bloodline. Transfer documents with blanks for serial numbers and legal descriptions. A form lease with rent calculated by appraised value and a term long enough to calm lenders. My phone buzzed again, this time a text from Laura, asking if I would be home for dinner and whether I could bring the vendor insurance list so she could update holiday cards. I typed that I would be late and that the office had already handled the cards. I put the phone face down. My father once told me that a man should build in fair weather for the storm he knows will come. I had taken that to mean concrete and rafters. Sitting there with the drafts on my screen, I understood he also meant paper and signatures, and the discipline to move before the first wind hits. I printed the checklists David sent and stacked them square on the corner of my desk. The plan had shape now. It had dates and blanks and names assigned. It had a deadline that was not a suggestion. If Laura filed first, we could find ourselves explaining intent to a tin ear, while a judge put holds on accounts and tied knots around our ankles. If we filed first clean and orderly, then the story would be ours to tell. I turned off the lamp and stood in the doorway for a breath, taking in the smell of oil and paper, and old coffee, the ordinary scent of work. I drove straight to Helena before sunrise and parked behind a diner with a flickering neon sign. David had vouched for her the night before. She slid a legal pad across the table and asked for the names and the routines. I told her about Laura. I told her about Michael. I gave her the vehicles, the work schedules, the places they liked to meet when they pretended to be helpful members of the community. Patricia listened and kept her pen moving. She said she would not touch anything that needed a court order, and she would not do anything that would contaminate evidence. She said she would document and she would verify. She asked for a week and a retainer. I paid without blinking. For the first few days, I kept my head down at the yard while David and I built the new structure piece by piece. Appraisals were ordered. Lease drafts waited for signatures. Between calls, I would glance at the phone and wonder where Patricia was and what she was seeing. On the fourth night, my phone buzzed just after dark. "Bring a jacket and keep your lights off 2 miles shy of the resort," she wrote. Big sky. The road climbed into the hills and the temperature dropped. I cut the headlights where she said and eased onto the shoulder. Patricia pointed toward a lodge where the lights burned soft and gold. "Your wife arrived an hour ago. Cash at the desk." She used the name Walker. The man arrived 20 minutes later. He parked by the service entrance and came in through the bar. I watched the lobby through the windshield. A door opened, and Laura stepped into view, wearing a scarf I had seen 100 times, and now could hardly stand to look at. Michael walked in 3 minutes after her. He did not look around. He had learned that much. They crossed the lobby separately, then turned toward the elevator as if pulled by a single string. Patricia lifted a camera and took 3 quick shots. Her hands were steady. When the elevator chimed again, they came down with the same quiet caution. They sat at the bar for 20 minutes and talked close. They left separately. Laura went out the front, went out the swant. Michael went out the service door and turned toward the far lot. Patricia wrote again and nodded toward the road. "That is enough for tonight." The next afternoon, she texted that she had something I needed to see. Patricia opened a binder and laid out the photographs. Hotel entrance, elevator bank, bar. She slid a receipt across the desk. Michael had covered dinner at a restaurant in town, and in his haste to look careful, he had used his own card. The printout showed a timestamp that matched her notes to the minute. She opened another folder, and this one felt heavier. A week of trash pulls had produced paper with letterheads that made my stomach turn. There was a draft checklist from a well-known forensic accounting firm in Bozeman, printed months ago, with boxes next to words that were too familiar. Fixed asset register, depreciation schedules, aged receivables, cash flow forecasts, bank statements for 12 months, copies of key contracts. There was a business card from a senior manager at that firm with a date scribbled on the back from early spring last year. Patricia laid out a calendar page where she had taped dates across 2 years. 18 months, she said. At least that long. Your wife began building this case before the snow melted last year. The list on that letterhead read like a transcript of the questions Laura had been asking me at the dinner table. How do you depreciate the excavators? What is your bonding capacity? Who are your preferred subs when a schedule slips? Do the hospital contracts include a standard retention? Patricia slid one last document across the desk. It was a photocopy of a retainer agreement. The year at the top was 12 months before I had noticed anything at all. I asked Patricia how hard it would be for them to reach my bank. She said lawyers call, they ask questions, and sometimes fear does the rest. She said she could not get bank records without a court order, and she would not try, but she did not need them to see how this was meant to play. We talked through next steps. Patricia would continue to document. She would keep her distance and her camera ready. As I stood to leave, she told me something I did not want to hear, but needed to understand. They are not guessing, she said. They have a plan and a timeline, and they believe you will react the way most men do. Loud, late, and without a paper trail. Do not give them what they expect. 18 months of careful preparation meant the fight in front of me had been built piece by piece while I was still telling myself that everything at home was a rough patch. On the drive back to the yard, the valley looked sharper than usual, like the air had been scrubbed clean. I thought about the timeline David had set. 14 days to put the trust in motion and the leases in place. 14 days to turn a company built on handshakes and hard hats into a structure that could take a legal blow and stay on its feet. The evidence Patricia handed me changed the temperature of those days. We were not racing a rumor anymore. We were racing a schedule drafted on someone else's letterhead. I parked behind the office and went straight to the conference room. I told Thomas the short version. He just nodded and slid a fresh pad across the table and asked what needed to be pulled first and who needed to be told not to leave anything in a shared drive. We began to list names, contracts, serial numbers. Later, when the crews had gone and the copier had gone quiet, I took Patricia's binder into my office and placed it next to the drafts from David. There are moments when two sets of papers make a third thing in your mind. Not fear, not rage. Focus. Laura's questions had been a script. Michael's confidence had been a deadline. The calendar pinned to Patricia's wall had been a clock I had not known was ticking. I stood there in the still room and felt the shape of what needed to happen settle into place. Every hour from here on out would count twice. Every signature would need to be clean. Every explanation to a banker or underwriter would need to be precise and calm. I understood at last that I was not simply preparing for a fight. I was already in one. The other side had been marching for a year and a half, and I had just now found the trail. By the weekend, I drove out to the ranch and let the gravel drum under the tires until the house rose out of the cottonwoods. I knew better. I was here because family business belongs on family ground. Martha arrived not 10 minutes after I did her sedan rolling to a stop like a verdict. She said she had heard I was moving assets and building a trust with my name on it, and that if I was carving Hayes Group out of reach, she wanted to hear it from my mouth. I told her Hayes Group was not something I built, and not something I ever claimed as mine alone. I told her the trust I was putting in place at David's direction had one goal: to protect what the land and the work already were, and to keep the operating company from being gutted by a fight I did not start. I said, separate property is exactly what it sounds like if you keep it that way, and that the ranch and the core of the family holdings were always intended to pass within the bloodline. She said money has a way of deciding who counts as family and who does not. I told her I kept it quiet because I wanted to build my own company with my own hands and my own mistakes, and because I wanted to walk into town as Daniel the contractor and not Daniel the heir. I am building a fence where the law says one should stand so that what was meant to be preserved is preserved. She said the family name could be a fence or a bridge depending on who holds the nails. I said I would show her the plans and the signatures, and she could sit with David and ask him what each line meant. She said she would consider it. Nora's car came up the drive while we were still on the porch. She stepped out with Emily holding her hand and a paper bag that turned out to be muffins. We moved into the kitchen. Martha asked Nora if she knew what I was doing. Nora said she knew her father was protecting the ranch and the company because both fed people who did not have a say in any of this. Martha said protection and control looked the same from a distance. Nora said distance was not the problem here. Values were. She said her mother had changed. She said the woman who taught her to tell the truth had become someone who used truth like a tool to pry things loose. She said she had watched Laura press me for details that had nothing to do with marriage and everything to do with inventory. Martha looked at her, and something in her softened, then hardened again. We did, all four of us, crossing the yard, with the sprinkler ticking and the mountains looking close enough to touch. Emily fell back to walk beside me. She asked if this ranch would always be ours. I told her that land stays with people who love it enough to work it, and that families last when they take care of each other even when it is hard. I said when she was older, she would understand why keeping a place takes more than paper. Martha leaned on a post and asked me to explain again what exactly the trust would hold. I said the land, the heavy iron, the name, the long-term contracts that give the company a steady pulse. Hayes Construction would lease what it needed and run the work. The trust would not run the crews or bid jobs. It would own and guard what could not be easily replaced. She asked if that meant she would never have a say in anything again. I said it meant the ranch and the core assets would not be diced up to solve a fight that belonged to two people and not to a county full of laborers and their families. I said she would have the same voice any blood has in a family built on the idea that stewardship outruns appetite. Nora took Emily's hand and showed her how to offer the back of a palm to the mare. Emily held still, and the horse breathed on her skin, and she squealed quietly. Martha spoke again, softer this time. She said our father had trusted me because I was the one who stayed close to the land and the work. She said she would hold me to it. I told her I expected nothing less. I told her I would send her the drafts, and that if any of it felt like a trick, she could drag me back to that kitchen table, and we would fight it out, line by line. On the porch, Martha paused with her keys in her hand. She said one more thing. If Laura comes for blood, she will not do it alone. People will take sides. Make sure the side you choose is small and clean. Then she drove away. We sat on the steps. Nora said she could not fix her mother. She said she could stand beside me if I kept the fight out of the parts of life that did not deserve it. I told her I would try, but that the mess had already spread further than I liked. I felt something inside me unclench. I went inside and wrote Martha's words on a pad and stuck it to the refrigerator with a magnet shaped like a trout. Small and clean. Then I pulled out David's draft again and read the clauses that bind land to a bloodline and the sections that make the operating company a tenant with duties spelled in plain language. Emily's shoes thumped across the floor, and Nora called for her to wash her hands. The argument with Martha was not over. It would not be over soon. But something had shifted back onto its rails. Nora's faith gave me a steadiness no document could. Emily's question gave me a compass. I stood at the sink and looked out at the yard, where my father once stood, rinsing dirt from his hands, at the same spot, and I felt the decision in my bones. The land would be kept. The company would be defended. The fight would be carried in a way that did not poison the well we all drank from. By mid-morning, a foreman from a firm across town called to ask if we were still taking deliveries, and a concrete supplier texted Thomas to say he had heard Laura would take half the company and that our schedules might slide into the ditch. A carpenter with 20 years under his belt asked if payroll would hit Friday like always. I told him yes and meant it. Another guy wanted to know if the bonding company had put a hold on anything. I told him no and that I had spoken to our agent before breakfast. Just before lunch, the developer for an outpatient clinic near Four Corners called my office and asked to press pause on the contract signing. She said she needed a week to breathe. She said her board wanted to see stability on our end. I thanked her for the call and told her I would get her what she needed. Frank Doyle asked me to meet him for coffee at a place on Main, where the floor creaks and the donuts sell out by 9. He said the town is watching. He said people want to see if I stand up straight or hunch my shoulders. Then he reached across and thumped the table once and told me he would keep every delivery on our books, so long as I kept my promises on paper and in dirt. I told him I would. No speeches. Facts. I laid out the steps with the trust and the leases. I told them the assets that matter are ring-fenced and the operating company has what it needs to work without a stumble. I said the surety had confirmed our bonding remains in place and our bank had been briefed with no covenants triggered. I spent the week walking job sites at first light and last light. Not bravado. Plain talk. This is where we stand. This is what is signed. This is what is next. I asked the office to draft a letter to clients. David reviewed every line so it would say exactly what needed saying and nothing more. It explained that Hayes Construction operates under a structure that shields essential assets through a lawful trust. It stated that leases are executed, insurance is endorsed, and that our capacity to perform remains unchanged. It confirmed that staff and subs have been briefed and schedules hold. We sent it to hospital administrators, to developers with projects in planning, to the county engineer who signs off on road closures, and to the banks who sit behind some of those deals. The first test came 2 days later. The hospital sent their project manager and their quality control guy for a site walk. We toured the drainage work and the expanded parking lines. They asked whether the asset restructure would affect warranty obligations. I answered that warranties sit with the operating company and that the operating company sits in the same chair it did last month. After the walk, I walked them to their truck. The PM paused with his hand on the door and said his board had raised an eyebrow, but that professionalism carries weight. He said they would keep the inspection schedule for the following week, and that if we hit our marks, the rest would take care of itself. The outpatient clinic developer called back to say that her board still wanted a week, but that they appreciated the clarity in our letter and the confirmation from the hospital. Every morning I stood at the huddle and handed the day plan to the lead and asked him to read it aloud. One schedule kept one inspection passed, one invoice paid. I kept it to that pattern so men knew what to expect. Someone told a cousin who told a banker who told a subcontractor that Michael had a list of our clients and was calling them one by one. We kept crews on task. We hit trench compaction numbers. I made sure people saw those facts, the way you make sure a post is tamped tight before you leave it. Frank and I met again midweek this time in the back of his parts warehouse, where the smell of rubber and grease sticks to your clothes. He told me some vendors had asked whether they should require cash on delivery. He had told them no because panic is contagious and because I do not miss invoices. He said I should be ready for one or two who would switch terms anyway. He said to pay and move on. I told him that is what we would do. The men in the field watched me do small things that bosses sometimes forget. I helped set a catch basin, not because I was needed, but because another set of hands said what all the speeches could not. I hauled a pallet of pavers when a forklift was still 20 minutes away. I stood in the mud with a young inspector and talked him through a detail without treating him like a burden. Less certainty in the stories that said we would fold. More people hedging their bets. That afternoon, the hospital sent an email confirming the inspection schedule for Tuesday at 8. They asked us to be ready to walk the new lot and submit the final grading survey by close of business. I printed the email and pinned it to the board in the trailer, where every man would see it when he signed out. On the way home, I drove past to the outpatient clinic site and parked at the edge of the lot, where the survey stakes stood like thin bones. I sat with my hands on the wheel and thought about how quickly confidence can evaporate and how slowly it returns. My phone buzzed with a message from David. He had filed another set of documents and wanted me to review the updated lease schedule in the morning. I answered that I would be in his office at 7. I turned the key and headed for the highway, a small piece of paper in my pocket that said the next inspection would happen on time, and for that night it was enough. June heat shimmered over Helena when we walked into the courthouse and took our seats. David set his yellow pad in front of him and gave me the smallest nod, the one that means keep your breathing even and your hands still. Across the aisle, Laura sat with a Denver attorney in a dark suit who looked like he had not lost many fights. The clerk called our case and the judge took the bench. Laura's attorney rose with a stack of binders and spoke in that calm, measured way that tells a story before it becomes a verdict. He asked the court to award his client $9 million, one half of Hayes Construction, the ranch in Gallatin Valley, and $15,000 a month in spousal support for a period he described as reasonable given the length of the marriage. He said the marriage was a partnership in every meaningful sense, and that my success had been built on his client's unpaid labor and social capital. The forensic accountant came next, a man with neat hair and a voice that carried. He had colored tabs for every section. He walked the court through a valuation built on 3 methods. Income approach, using normalized earnings market approach, using guideline companies and asset approach, using adjusted book value for the heavy iron. He spoke of backlog and bonding capacity and the premium he placed on long-standing client relationships. He concluded that the fair market value of the business sat at a figure that made the words half and equalization loom like a storm front. David sat quiet and took notes while the man talked. When it was our turn, he stood and walked to the lectern with no binder at all, only a thin folder and a steady voice. He began with context. Hayes Construction, as it stands today, operates as an operating entity. The core assets are held by Hayes Family Trust, a lawful structure formed for business and family stewardship. Reasons months before any petition in this matter. He let the dates hang in the air. He submitted certified copies of the trust instrument and the schedules listing the equipment and land conveyed. He submitted lease agreements that set forth fair market rent and maintenance obligations with insurance endorsements naming the proper parties. He submitted notices to the bank and to the surety letters sent well in advance acknowledging the structure and affirming that operations and covenants would continue unchanged. The Gallatin property came to Mr. Hayes by inheritance from his father. In this jurisdiction, inherited property is separate property if kept separate and if treated as such. The trust instrument contains a bloodline provision that aligns with the stated intent of the decedent and the family history. Laura's counsel objected to the idea that paper could draw a magic circle around value. He suggested the transfers were timed to frustrate equitable distribution. David did not raise his voice. He pointed again to the dates to the appraisals commissioned before any filing to the business reasons spelled out in board resolutions and memoranda to lenders and underwriters. He noted that the operating entity had performed under the leases for months, that rent had been paid, that maintenance schedules had been executed, that clients had been notified where required, and had continued to receive performance without interruption. He spoke of substance over form and invited the court to look as deeply as it wished. The forensic accountant returned for rebuttal and tried to fold goodwill back into the operating entity, as if relationships and brand could be captured with a net and handed to whoever wanted them. David answered that goodwill in a construction business lives in performance and personnel, and that the operating company had kept both. People do. Schedules do. The judge asked a series of questions that sounded like someone checking the load on a trailer. When exactly was the trust formed? What assets were conveyed on day one and which later? Who controlled the trust and who benefited? What rent had been paid and on what schedule? What did the bank and the surety say at the time? David answered each in order with documents to match, and the clerk marked the exhibits with a quiet rhythm that kept my pulse from running away. I kept my hands folded. Her attorney shifted to the story he had come to tell. He spoke about the marriage and all the ways she had helped me build what I built. Then he walked toward me and asked the court to take notice of the man at the table who would not have become what he became without the woman beside him. I felt the room tilt toward theater. Laura stood. The judge had not called on her, but she stood anyway. The attorney tried to pull her back into the chair with a palm pressed lightly to her sleeve. She shook him off and spoke loud enough that the bailiff shifted his weight. She said the court should know that any number on those papers owed half of its ink to her hands, and that I was nothing without her. The judge told her to sit. He told everyone to hold their tongues. He asked the reporter to read back the last question and answer. I did not nod. I did not flinch. I let the air move in and out of my lungs while the clock on the back wall ticked like a metronome. David touched my sleeve with one finger, a reminder that the work was not emotion but sequence. He rose again and addressed the court, as if the outburst had never happened. He returned to law. He acknowledged that marriage is a partnership and said that equity could be achieved with numbers that reflected the reality of an operating company that leases its assets and does not own them, and that the ranch could not be awarded where the law draws a clear boundary. He did not gloat. He did not press. He simply steadied the case on its feet and let it stand. The judge gave him 10 minutes and left the bench. The moment his robe disappeared behind the door, the room exhaled. I kept my gaze off him and on the table. I felt again the edge of the manila folder inside my briefcase. The paper within was not a flourish. It was a fact. It would speak when the time was right. The bailiff called the room to order as the judge returned. He noted for the record that the outburst would be disregarded except as a measure of decorum. He asked counsel to continue. Laura's attorney shot a look at his client that said what needed saying. Then he lifted his file and tried to steer back to valuations and multipliers and the color of money on paper. The work ahead simple in its steps and heavy in its doing. I folded my hands and kept my breathing even. I met Laura's eyes one last time and then looked away, not in surrender, but in preparation. The next move would not be a raised voice or a claim dressed as morality. The next move would be paper. I stood and asked the judge for a moment. My voice did not waver, though my chest tightened. He gave a short nod, and I reached down into the leather briefcase that had sat beside me like a silent companion for weeks. The manila envelope felt heavier than it should have, its corners softened from being handled too many times. I placed it on the table, opened the flap, and slid the stack of papers free. I said that if I truly was nothing without her, then these documents would show what nothing really looks like. The bailiff carried them to the bench. The room went still, even the shuffling in the gallery stopped. The judge lifted the first sheet, adjusted his glasses, and began to read. His eyes traced the words slowly, lips pressing tight, as he moved from page to page. It was the inheritance certificate sealed and notarized, naming me lawful successor to controlling shares in Hayes Group, the private corporation that has stood for decades as the wealthiest in Montana. The language was blunt and precise, leaving no space for doubt. Attached was the Hayes family charter, written long before my marriage, requiring every heir to preserve the group's core assets from any division or dilution in the event of divorce. It carried the signatures of men whose hands had long since turned to dust, but whose words still bound the living. Next came a letter from the outside counsel of Hayes Group, a firm with more weight than any voice in this courtroom. The letter confirmed the inheritance, confirmed the charter, confirmed the validity of the protections in corporate law that no spouse could unwind. It was not my voice anymore. It was the law, cold and sharp, speaking louder than any argument. The judge turned to the Hayes Family Trust. The trust agreement bore a date long before any petition had been filed. It listed the ranch 200 acres in Gallatin Valley, conveyed into the trust, with a bloodline clause that barred transfer to anyone outside the family. It listed the heavy iron, the excavators, graders, trucks, all titled to the trust, insured and maintained under lease. It listed the trademarks, the master contracts, every core asset. Attached were copies of leases signed between the trust and Hayes Construction. Fair market rent maintenance obligations, insurance riders, all signed and already in effect. There were copies of rent checks cleared with bank stamps, maintenance logs with foreman's signatures, insurance endorsements initialed by underwriters. No theory, no promise. Execution. David rose at the proper time. His voice was calm, level, like a carpenter squaring a beam. He said, inheritance under Montana law remains separate property if treated as such, and that this inheritance had been preserved in full accordance with the law. He said the trust was not camouflage, not an attempt to hide, but a lawful business mechanism drafted and filed months before any petition designed for succession planning and asset protection. He reminded the court that fraudulent transfer requires intent to hinder or defraud, and that such intent could not be proven when banks, bonding companies, and counterparties had all been notified and had consented without hesitation. He pointed to the fact that operations had continued smoothly, payroll met inspections, past clients served. The line between owner and operator had been drawn months ago in daylight, with every stamp of approval in place. Laura's attorney leapt up, his tone sharp, insisting the transfers were timed to frustrate her rights. He waved his hands at the trust documents, called them a shell. He tried to drag the words fraudulent transfer across the floor, like a rope meant to trip us. David did not raise his voice. He pointed to dates, to notarizations, to filings with the Secretary of State, to bank confirmations, to letters from surety companies. He reminded the court that timing alone is not fraud, and that intent matters, substance matters, and that the only substance here was protection of a business that employs 70 people and feeds hundreds more. He said Laura's claim of half would not be taken from the trust any more than half of the Yellowstone River could be scooped into a bucket and declared personal property. The judge leaned forward, asked questions with the precision of a man tightening bolts. What rent had been paid? David produced checks. What insurance coverage? David handed over endorsements. Who held trustee control? An independent fiduciary, not me, with family succession clauses beyond my reach. Who benefited? Blood heirs only written decades ago into the family's constitution. Each answer came with paper. Each objection Laura's attorney raised was met by the stamp of an official seal or the ink of a dated signature. I looked at Laura while this played out. Her face lost its color, her lips pressed tight. The confidence she had carried into this building drained out, leaving something harder, thinner. She leaned into her lawyer, but he had less to offer her now. His pen tapped the table, but his eyes would not meet the judge's. Michael sat behind them, eyes fixed on the floor, his posture collapsed inward. The man who once boasted about undercutting me on bids now looked like he wanted the wood grain to swallow him whole. The judge closed the folder and rested his hand on it. He rubbed the bridge of his nose, then spoke evenly. He said he would recess for 30 minutes to review the record further and confer with his staff. His tone carried no bias, no warmth, but in the silence that followed, I heard the shift. The case had tilted. The foundation Laura's team built had cracked under the weight of the documents. The gavel struck and the room exhaled. Reporters scribbled in the back row. A bailiff called for order, though no one dared raise their voice. David leaned close and whispered that we had given the court exactly what it needed. He told me to sit still and let the paper work. I nodded once and kept my eyes forward. Laura hissed something at her lawyer, her fingers tight on his sleeve. He pulled back gently, his face drawn. Michael did not look up. The whispers in the gallery turned toward me, not with sympathy, but with recognition. A storm had passed through, and what remained standing was clear to anyone watching. The judge left the bench, the door closing behind his robe. I sat back, folded my hands, and listened to the hum of the vent. I thought about my father's hand on mine when he first showed me the ranch deed. I thought about the years of sweat poured into iron and timber, and I thought about Laura's voice calling me nothing. I breathed in and let the silence hold me. The paper had spoken, and the room knew it. When the judge returned, the air in the courtroom tightened again. He settled behind the bench, touched the folder, and spoke in the measured cadence of someone laying a foundation. He found the trust valid and independent. He recognized the inheritance as separate property preserved according to law. He declined to award any interest in the ranch. He noted that valuation arguments built on assets no longer owned by the operating company would not control the outcome. He left support and fees to negotiation in light of the record, and he urged the parties to consider resolution rather than a long winter of paper and hearings. David turned to me. I felt a calm I had not felt in months. I told him to make the offer we had discussed in case the day went this way. He stood and put it on the record. A single payment of $900,000 within 30 days in exchange for a full and final release of all claims, no appeals, and a covenant not to interfere with Hayes Group, Hayes Family Trust, or Hayes Construction. Each entity named, each boundary drawn. Laura's attorney asked for a recess to confer. The judge granted it, and we moved to a small conference room with walls the color of sand. Laura sat at the end of the table with her hands flat and her jaw tight. Laura looked at me only once. After 20 minutes, her attorney returned to the judge and said they would accept. The judge asked a few clarifying questions, spoke to the court reporter, and directed the lawyers to draft an order that captured the terms cleanly. On the courthouse steps, June heat hit like a wall. Across the square, Nora waited with Emily. Nora stepped forward and wrapped me in a hug that held longer than a greeting and shorter than a goodbye. She asked softly if we could go to the ranch this weekend to see the horses. I told her we could. That afternoon, I wired the retainer for the settlement into a dedicated account and called the bank president to schedule the release when the order arrived. I called the surety and the bonding agent and thanked them for their patience. I called Frank and told him the concrete for the bridge deck would pour on schedule and that coffee was on me in the morning. Then came the part of the storm that never makes the paper, the cleanup. With David's guidance, I initiated Michael's expulsion from the partnership under the provisions we had all signed when the company was young and the future seemed uncomplicated. The notice cited breaches no one could deny. Disclosure of confidential information. Conduct adverse to the firm. A buyout at book value calculated to the penny, no premium, no parade. We scheduled a brief meeting at the office. He handed over keys, a laptop, and a fob. I thanked him for the work he had done in better years. He nodded once and left without shaking my hand. Laura moved to Colorado within a month. Through friends of friends, I heard she leased a small storefront on a street with nice foot traffic and set up an interior design studio. The invoices did not line up with the calendar. I did not take pleasure in it. The world does not need more gloating. Martha called the week after the hearing and asked to sit with David and me at the ranch. We spread the trust instrument and the charter on my father's table, the same table where he had counted calves and signed loan renewals. She asked hard questions about control and succession and whether my daughter and her child would be protected from the same storms. David answered with clauses and dates and a simple explanation of duties. Martha listened, then folded her hands and said she understood. She did not apologize, and I did not ask her to. At Hayes Construction, the air changed as if a window had been opened. The hospital kept the inspection on Tuesday at 8. We walked the lot with their project manager, while a survey crew ran the final shots. He signed the form without hesitation. That afternoon, a notice from their board arrived approving a new phase of work. The county sent a purchase order for winter sanding preparation months ahead of when they usually do. We had a Friday morning huddle that felt different. Thomas read the day plan and added 2 words at the end. Good work. I brought a box of donuts that vanished in 3 minutes. I laughed and told him to put the shovel to good use. Vendors loosened their terms back to normal without making a speech about it. He said it looked better than he expected and that he would keep telling people the same. Public respect does not arrive in a bouquet. It shows up as a string of small acknowledgments. A nod from a commissioner at the grocery store. A clerk at the bank who says quietly that her brother works for us and slept better this week. A neighbor who slows his truck at the end of the lane and lifts 2 fingers from the wheel. There was paperwork to finish. The court order arrived and the wire went out. Laura's counsel filed receipts and releases language that turned down the flame on months of conflict. I told him I would try. On a clear afternoon, I drove out to the ranch with Nora and Emily. Emily ran ahead and then came back to slip her hand into mine. Nora asked how I felt now that the dust had settled. I searched for a word that fit and landed on lighter, a load redistributed to where it belonged. I stood at the fence my father and I rebuilt when I was 15 and ran my fingers over a knot in the grain that my hand finds without looking. The phone vibrated with an email from the hospital, a new contract award for site work on an additional wing. I forwarded it to Thomas with a simple line that said, "Get the team ready." He answered with a single word. Ready. I watched Emily chase her shadow along the fence, and I thought about karma in the plainest sense. Not mysticism, just the way the world answers a set of choices made over time. Laura had chosen a story where shouting could replace substance. Michael had chosen a shortcut disguised as strategy. I had chosen paper and patience and the steady grind of showing up. The town had watched. The judge had read. The crews had worked. In the end, the ledger balanced. Night came on slow. We walked back to the truck with the smell of mint rising from the creek. Nora squeezed my arm and said the house would like a new coat of paint before the snow. I told her I would call Frank for a sprayer, and that if he insisted on delivering it himself, we would let him. I paused at the door and looked out over the fields. One more time, the lines straight, the fences tight, the work waiting for morning. I walked the fence line out of habit palm, brushing the top rail, eyes landing on knots I had known since I was a boy. My father taught me to sight down a line the way a carpenter sights a board. He would say in that voice of his that land is the thread that ties the dead to the living, and the living to those not yet born. Nora came out with a halter over her shoulder, and Emily at her side a helmet, a size too big, bobbing as she walked. She asked if today was the day. I told her it was. Nora laughed and said her daughter had been ready for a week, and that the horse had been ready longer than that. We led the old mare from the corral, the kind that has more patience than speed. I checked the cinch, set my palm on the saddle horn, and showed Emily where to place her foot. She hesitated, gathered herself, and swung a leg over. The mare took 2 slow steps, and Emily laughed. She looked down at me and asked if she was doing it right. I told her if she kept her heels down and her eyes up, she could not be far wrong. We walked the inside of the fence, Nora with a hand on Emily's boot, me slightly ahead with the lead rope loose. I thought about the months behind us, about paper that steadied a life when voices tried to knock it sideways. Revenge, if that is what some wanted to call it, had never been about breaking someone else. It had been about refusing to be broken. At the far corner of the pasture, Emily asked if she could go a little faster. We let the mare stretch into a gentle jog. Emily tipped her head back and looked at the sky, and then she asked the question that has sat at the center of my chest since she first learned the word ours. Will this ranch always belong to us? I thought of my father, of Samuel Hayes Sr., of the day he pressed the old deed into my palm and told me it was a promise more than a title. I thought of the courtroom and the paper that had set things back onto their rails. I told Emily that as long as people named Hayes honor work and keep their word and show up when the day asks them to, this land will remain in their hands. I said the land belongs to those who love it enough to sweat for it. We turned back toward the house. Nora walked close and asked if the hospital contract had cleared. I told her it had, and that the crew would set forms next week. She rolled her eyes the way daughters do when they pretend to be annoyed, and said that the house would like a new coat of paint before the first frost. I promised to call Frank and ask if his sprayer was free, and she said he would insist on delivering it himself just to check whether I was using it right. That is how this valley works. People offer help, and then show up to make sure you take it. I unsaddled and tossed a flake of hay into the feeder. Nora brushed dust off Emily's knees, and they went inside to wash up. I stayed in the aisle and listened to the soft sound of a horse pulling hay into its mouth, and the faint tick of cooling metal from the old tractor. On the porch, I sat where my father used to sit, boots on the step, hands loose on my knees. The fields stretched out in straight lines and right angles, the kind of geometry that comes from a long practice of turning sweat into order. I thought about Laura and how quickly a story can become a knife. I thought about Michael and the hollow want that makes a man trade friendship for a shortcut. I did not wish either of them harm. The world has its own way of balancing choices. I had seen it more times than I can count. Sometimes it looks like a job lost. Sometimes it looks like a door that will not open. Sometimes it looks like a woman staring at a closed sign in a storefront window and realizing that charm does not take the place of math. Nora brought out 2 cups of coffee and sat beside me. We watched Emily chase a dog across the yard and fall and get up and fall again and laugh every time. Nora asked what I would tell my younger self if I could tap him on the shoulder back when he was building all this with nothing but grit and a ledger. I said I would tell him to write things down and keep promises and remember that paper is not just paper when it carries the weight of truth. I would tell him that a day will come when a single document keeps the roof over more than one head. He would not believe me then, but he would nod out of respect. I could feel the tired in my bones in the right way, the kind that tells you the day was spent well. I closed my eyes for a moment and saw the judge turning pages. David's steady hand tapping a line. Patricia's camera shutter catching what needed to be caught. I saw my father setting a post with a level in his back pocket and a look that said, "Keep going until it is right." It is the same look I hope Emily sees on my face when she turns to me in 10 years and asks where to place a gate. Night settled. The kitchen threw a warm square of light onto the yard, and the sound of dishes and water drifted out to the porch. I stood and stretched and felt a small crack pop in my spine like a reminder that time only moves one direction. I took one last look at the fields, straight lines and tight fences, and work waiting for morning, and I felt a simple peace that owed nothing to victory and everything to endurance. If this story found you at a time when you needed a hand on your shoulder, remember this. You do not have to break anyone to keep what matters. You have to stand when they expect you to fall. You have to prepare when others are busy talking. And sometimes when the noise gets loud, one clean sheet of paper can put the world back on level.